Jerry, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you, Elijah. Always great to be with you.
All right. Now, I'd like to start with the trade war that Trump is creating. He just announced new tariffs on China, and China is saying, hey, this is not okay, and we're going to essentially retaliate with more tariffs. What is your perspective on what this is leading to?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. First of all, it was actually $200 billion. It's $200 billion is what he put on China this week, and that's supposed to scale up. It's going to be starting at 10% on $200 billion worth of goods from China. And then that's going to scale up to 25% at the end of the year. That's basically buying the GOP some time for the midterms. They don't want to create havoc right before the voters go to the polling booths. Alibaba's CEO, Jack Ma, had a fairly interesting comment on all of this. He's an observer, of course, from the East, watching this from that vantage point. And from his vantage point, we're in the very early innings of what's probably going to be upwards of a 20-year economic battle. This is according to Jack Ma, again, the CEO of Alibaba, and he has some really good insights. So he's certainly a voice worth listening to. You listen to people here in the United States, and the concept of this trade war is that we're going to teach China a lesson. How are we going to do it? We're going to slap $200 billion in direct taxes upon U.S. consumers who buy Chinese goods. Well, that may or may not end up working. What's happened over the last several decades, Elijah, is that the United States has gone from being the ultimate economic hegemon, having total hegemonic control of the economy, at one point controlling 40% of global GDP back in the 1940s, 1950s, in the post-World War II era, where all of those institutions were created. The IMF, the WTO, the World Bank, and of course, the United Nations, and all of these institutions that were created for the benefit of the United States are now being used as blunt weapons by the savvy Chinese, by our competitors who are rising. So China has figured out a way to take the existing economic infrastructure and use it against us. This is why you see President Trump making some pretty wild claims, and also kind of making some wild decisions, like possibly pulling us out of the WTO, or trashing the World Bank, or talking negatively about NAFTA and existing trade organizations that we already have. This is the I wouldn't say it's the dying gasp of an empire, but it is certainly the empire in decline. And so the United States is basically losing to China. If you look at the actual GDP, gross domestic product, not in constant dollars, the way that the media here in the United States always promotes it and says, hey, look, the United States is the largest economy in the world because GDP in constant dollars shows that we are. But if you actually look at GDP in a different way, if you look at it with purchasing power parity, that is, how far does a dollar stretch in a particular economy, you'll find, according to the IMF, according to Economist Magazine, according to all of these Western institutions, you'll discover that China became the largest economy, according to that metric, in 2014. And we have been eating China's dust ever since that time, which explains why many people look at the United States, especially during the Obama administration, and said, look how weak the White House is. Look how weak America looks. Well, that weakness may have been partially the leadership style of Obama, President Obama, but it was also the fact that we have been eclipsed, and it hasn't been digested yet, Elijah, by the American public. They don't fully realize, because when you listen to the corporate media, you would think that China is hell-bent upon its own destruction. China is also a really tough thing, I think, for many Americans to grasp and to swallow, because its success, that is. And that is because it has lifted more than 400 million people out of poverty over the last 30 years without relying upon unbridled capitalism. It's actually relied not just on the free market, but it's relied, in fact, upon state-controlled capitalism. This is something that we are told here in U.S. textbooks, economics textbooks, that's not supposed to work. That's not supposed to how it's supposed to be. You're supposed to give corporations total free reign. They're supposed to be able to do whatever they want and have rights, and everything works out best in the end, even if a few people get stepped on. But in China, they're viewing it differently, and they've had what can only be described as the greatest economic miracle in world history. And that is, over the last 30 years, seeing 400 million people rise from abject poverty and now living in the cities. Every single year, 10 or 15 to 20 million Chinese citizens are moving out of the country into the city. You look at for example, if you look at an 8-year period, the last 8 years, it's like China's cities have taken on an entire Japan. And this is happening every 8 years. So China's cities are rising. China is on the rise. They are a larger economy than we are. Their military is growing at a very fast clip, and they aren't even spending the amount of money that we are. But when they do, you can imagine how large their military will be. They have a massive population. They have a vast territorial expanse, and they are constantly one step ahead of us when it comes to making decisions. This is why, again, going back to what you had pointed out about President Trump, it's not that President Trump is weak or strong. It's not that President Obama was weak or strong. It's that America itself is weakening, and the figurehead that we see that weakness or strength in is the president. And so we tend to take it out on the president. And so President Obama was viewed as weak because the American empire was sinking compared to its competitors since our peak. And now that President Trump, is not a surprise he got voted into office. People wanted a strong man. They wanted a strong leader who, because Obama was weak and so Trump would be strong. But even now we're seeing Trump, tax American citizens, trying to shoot China in the back as it takes off and accelerates in front of us. And this is it's a really sad moment for an empire in decline. So I think all of the trade war that you see going on between the U.S. and China originates in America's recognition that China is outpacing it. And the only way to stop them in the Washington's mind is by, slapping tariffs upon their goods and thus penalizing U.S. citizens who buy Chinese goods. But that's not going to slow it down. In fact, there's a few things that survive nuclear winter. This is the old joke goes, and one of them happens to be, cockroaches, and the other one happens to be the U.S. consumer. U.S. consumers will buy. Even if you slap tariffs on things, they'll keep buying. So I don't see these tariffs working long term. I see them backfiring and boomeranging upon the United States. China has many more levers that it can pull, as does the United States. Could this end up in a hot war? Well, sure it could, and it probably will. There's the old Thucydides trap, which Graham Allison has wrote about, and it's very true that just as Athens and ancient Sparta, kind of ended up in a battle that was almost appeared inevitable. China and the United States are these two major powers, and it's going to lead to some sort of incursion. We may be seeing this may be the outer edge of the hurricane as we're moving into it. But I think Jack Ma is right, from Alibaba, the CEO, that this is a long-term thing. It's not going away. We need to be prepared for more of this, because the U.S. is not going to go down without a massive, massive fight, but go down it will.
Now, why do you think it is that China has seen so much success when in the United States, it seems like we have so much more of a free market? It's not entirely free, but isn't the free market supposed to be better for economic growth?
Well, I mean, yeah, and I would say to an extent, China also has what you would describe as a free market. It's been often argued that there's more capitalism actually happening in China than there is in the United States, and oftentimes many in the West will point to socialism and communism as these great ills, and yet they fail to recognize that they have socialism in their own country. I mean, if you look at many of the institutions we have here in the United States and in the economy, they're based upon socialist schemes. We could name many, but we won't for the sake of time. But I mean, there's so many different areas where we're relying upon this as well. But the other reason with China is the fact that, again, it is two things are happening. Number one, you have this massive population, which is growing by the millions every single year. By 2030, Elijah, there's going to be 1 billion people, 1 billion Chinese city dwellers. 1 billion. I mean, when that happens, Chinese cities alone are going to have a larger population than the entire 2 continents of North and South America. That happens 12 years from now. And all of those individuals are going to want the fruits of the modern technological society. They're going to want luxurious life hacks that other wealthy nations enjoy. They're going to want to eat better. They're going to want to drink. And food and water demand in China is, obviously immense and growing by the day. They have water shortages. Obviously, 2/3 of Chinese cities have water shortages. So that, they're facing their own situation. But when you take a look at the remainder of what's happening, you see China realizing that its resource intense kind of labor economy that it has now needs to morph into more of a high-tech kind of economy. And that's what you see with the Made in China 2025 issue that's going on. So China wants to make China great again. They want to make China great again. China has been great. It's a 5,000-year-old country. It must look at a 250-year-old country like the United States as a street punk who's a bully now, who's just suddenly risen. China's dealt with this before. It's never dealt with the magnitude of something like America. But it too has nationalism. It too has rising nationalism. And it too wants to make China great again. And so we find ourselves that, we're living in this nationalist age where China is certainly expressing nationalism. The United States is expressing an amount of nationalism. You see nationalism kind of harming the European experiment now in the European Union. But if you look at China, for example, specifically, they're targeting very specific key sectors to be made in China, to manufacture their own things, such as semiconductors, which is already distorting the semiconductor industry. Memory chips are going to be created or made and manufactured in China, and it'll only be a period of time before they also move into some of the more advanced semiconductor chips, which really are the foundation of our technological society. Aerospace equipment. China wants to build its own aerospace equipment. They want to build their own high-tech ships. They want to build their own railway equipment. They want to get into renewable energy much deeper than they already are, and they're already very advanced. They want to create their own agricultural machinery. They want to create their own power equipment and their own medical devices, their own information technology. So when you think about this is an absolute war upon the United States, which has really dominated these areas, and South Korea and some of the other advanced and developed Asian nations. So China is stepping into a place which is making many advanced nations very uncomfortable. And, the United States certainly is going to respond to that. How we've responded to that so far has been blowing up in our face. It's been boomeranging. So we'll see. We'll see how this all shapes up. But again, the nationalism that we see rising in the United States, that's also happening other places, and that includes China.
Now, you talked about essentially that in the United States, people haven't really come to the realization that China is now the biggest economy in the world. How long do you think it'll take, and what do you think the effects of this will be on the United States for us to, finally realize that, oh, wait, we're not the biggest economy anymore.
Yeah, this is, again, this is what we talked about in our book, Bankruptcy of Our Nation. And we talked about how the economic collapse of the United States was never something that was going to be fast and quick, that was a dream. It's a dream that would happen. That's not how empires crash. It would be nice. I think I've even said this before in your program. It would be nice if you could just end it quickly and it's over and the pain is over. Too bad that that's not how it goes. The British Empire tumbled at the beginning of the 20th century amid the rise of the United States economy. And it was a bruising, humbling moment for Great Britain as it realized that, its once mighty great empire, which the sun never set upon, was now suddenly being morphed into something much smaller as a competitor rose on the world stage. And quite a competitor it was, the United States. And so Britain lived in denial of their collapse. And I think that even in some cases, I would say there is still some denial, even still in Britain and in much of the European countries, but about what's happened. But I would say here in the United States that it's even more stubborn. Most American citizens are not aware that China is larger on a GDP PPP basis. That doesn't make it into the news. That makes it into IMF journals and makes it into statistics, white papers or whatever. Quite down the individual sitting in his living room, because that's negative news. You don't want to share that. I think also that this is going to be as I mentioned, a punishing, grueling decline that is going to be humiliating for the American people. And I think Trump is a manifestation of that. Trump is the strong man. Trump is the one who tells it like it is. Trump is the one who's going to stick it to the man. Trump is the one who's going to make America great again. Trump is the one who's going to stop the bleeding. Trump is the one who's going to patch the hole in the Titanic. Trump is the one. And I think that you find many people just living in denial by looking at Trump saying he'll make things better. Because if he doesn't, I mean, how many times have you heard people say on the political side, they say, well, oh my gosh, what if Hillary Clinton would have got in? What are they saying? That they're basically saying that America was on a very bad path. I mean, so they partially admit the fact that America is declining. They partially admit it, but they live in denial as if someone that they put into office can stop it, as if someone they could put into office back in Great Britain could stop or slow the demise of Great Britain. America has run its course. China has far outpaced the United States in so many areas. It's laughable, and we have been checkmated on numerous fronts. And I think the belligerence that's coming out of Washington in no way serves the purpose of stopping the bleeding. In fact, I think it probably speeds it up a little bit, because China is not in the mood to deal with these kinds of things. They can turn to other nations. There's a big misconception, Elijah, that China needs the United States, or otherwise they'll completely implode and collapse. What's funny about China is that it has such a massive domestic market that it doesn't serve quite well. In fact, it spends most of its time serving the world's customers. And it does, its domestic economy is enormous. And if they wanted to be like many other nations and just focus on their domestic economy, they would have one of the largest domestic economies to focus on. And so China could always do that. It could always, kind of re-divert its relationships. And that's what we see it doing now. Does China have its own problems? Sure. Does it have debt problems? Well, sure it does. But we can't bring up debt problems without talking about the biggest offender, and that's the United States. So, I think we're living in a lot of denial. I think this denial has been going on for a long time, especially since the 2008 crash when things really accelerated. And we have this idea that suddenly things are better, the economy is recovering, this and that. It is true that we're not in a free fall anymore on many asset classes, but that doesn't mean that things are better. It doesn't mean that things are necessarily improving. We would suggest quite the opposite, that the next crash we're going to have is going to be even more severe. That this is that we're in uncharted territory, but also we have historical precedent for the end of empire, and that's where we see the United States currently.
And what does this mean for the average person? I mean, how will the end of the U.S. empire, how will that affect them?
Well, I think overall, it's not. We're not going to be living in caves. We don't subscribe to a Mad Max scenario. We never have. We've always suggested that basically what has to happen is that there's a psychological readjustment. There's a psychological readjustment which is almost more painful than the financial. I mean, people aren't living in the streets in Britain. I mean, Britain is no longer the great empire that it once was, but people are fine over there. I expect the same thing to be here in the United States. But the problem with the United States versus Britain is the fact that we have specialized in consumption so much that it's going to be more bruising for us as our economy kind of resets to more of a realistic type of situation after we lose many of the benefits that come with being the world's greatest economic empire, or the economic hegemon. The first thing that comes to mind is the U.S. dollar. The U.S. dollar is something that continues to be an issue around the globe, and many are concerned about it in other nations. And over time, we expect to see the U.S. dollar continue to fade as its percentage of use across the globe. And that's going to lead overall, directly to answer your question, it'll lead to an overall decline in the wealth of the United States here. The inequalities will become more exacerbated, more evident, more obvious. Poverty in America will increase and continue to increase inexplicably. Many people will be surprised to see poverty rising, even as it is, but that's what we'll have to deal with. And it'll be an entire reshuffling of the deck here in the United States to kind of prepare for the new reality. And I think, as we pointed out at the very beginning, this is something that many Americans are in denial about. So that makes it even harder. It's one thing if you're prepared, right? If you're ready and say, okay, well, China's rising and they appear pretty unstoppable, and they're going to have 1 billion city dwellers in 2030, and they're all going to want the same things that we have, and we're going to have to learn how to deal with this. But there's no cognizance of that at all, Elijah. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It's we're going to beat China. We're going to put them in their place. We're going to stop them from, becoming great again. And, as long as you have that kind of mentality, you're going to be in for a big shock, especially psychologically.
Now, a lot of people, and we've talked about this before, think that, preparing for a crisis, we should hold real money, gold and silver, the money that have really protected people from these kinds of crises in the past. Now, recently on your podcast, you were talking about another precious metal that you think is actually a really, there might be a really amazing opportunity right now, platinum. It looks like it's at quite a bit of a low. It doesn't seem like it's been at this price for quite a while. And actually, you're noting that it had gone about to 750, maybe a little above that. But the last two times this happened was in 2004 and 2008. And after that, it rose significantly. So did you want to share with our viewers your view of why platinum seems to be a really amazing opportunity right now?
Yeah, you're right. We just did a podcast on this. Platinum is a metal that most people just don't tend to think about. They tend to think about, gold and silver or even copper. But platinum is one of those metals that's just kind of off most people's radar. And maybe it should be. But it seems like increasingly that's probably not a smart idea. Platinum, if you took all of the known supply of platinum, and you were to put it somewhere, it would fit in most normal living rooms. And that's all the platinum that's ever been mined. And so it's much more precious than silver, much more precious even than gold. And platinum is increasingly being used in high performance glass. It's being increasingly used in fuel cell electric vehicles, which use quite a bit of platinum. And typically, when people think of platinum in autos, you tend to think of the catalytic converter. And because palladium had such a cost advantage over platinum for many years, auto manufacturers began to move to palladium for their catalytic converters. It's really a pretty small amount. I mean, the average car probably has, $100 or $200 worth of palladium, in it, or platinum if you're using platinum. But when you look at these fuel cell electric vehicles, they use much more than that, and that's kind of the future. So we see platinum playing a role, and it's actually a much better metal versus palladium for these purposes. And so we see there's a tremendous amount of institutional interest in platinum, as there long has been. Industrial demand. What we don't really see is investor demand. If you look at the total pie for platinum, about 4% of the demand comes from investors. That's really small. I mean, it's really, really small. And so if you even have just a slight increase in that number, you could see a pretty sharp rise in platinum, because the supply and demand situation could become imbalanced in that case. But going back to the technicals, you had mentioned how platinum had broken out above 750. That was a key area of that. It held in 2004, as you had mentioned. It soared right after that from about 750 all the way up to about 2200, 2300. And then in 2008, it had a devastating collapse from those highs down to 750 again. And as soon as it hit 750, it catapulted right back up to about 2000. And it's since worked its way now back down to that 750 area about 6 weeks ago. And so just looking at a long-term chart, you see this is the third touch of the 750 level. And so at that point, we certainly don't necessarily have to see it go higher. It could fall, but the last two times it's risen fairly dramatically. So I think it's just something for investors to put on their radar. It certainly is at a very key multi-year support level that could be very bullish. But at the same time, if we see continued selling pressure and if we see it fall below the 750 level, then that may be off the table for now.
All right. Well, Jerry Robinson, thank you so much for joining us today.